So I got a little fancy and put a table lamp up there. Maybe this improved the lighting a little bit on my face compared to the previous podcast. Maybe not good enough for some. Okay, so cities, looking at more key findings from the report on thriving cities under climate change. Cities in low and middle income countries are less green in terms of air pollution. Air pollution from key urban sectors presents a greater challenge for larger cities in countries at all income levels. So cities in general tend to be concentrated in pollution, PM 2.5 and so on, based on traffics and construction and various other background climatic factors. Cities in low and middle income countries have worse air pollution than cities in high income countries. US definitely has much better air quality conditions than, let's say, China or India. And so similarly Europe is better than these Asian countries as well. Average PM 2.5 concentration across cities by countries income group 2000 to 2015. So here is average concentration of PM 2.5 in micrograms per meter cube, and there is a WHO standard which is something like 12 micrograms per meter cube as a safe level. I think you can look it up. So low income countries from 2000 to 2015, they have gotten worse. Lower middle income countries much higher, from 42.4 to 47.4 in terms of the range. And upper middle income, you can see it drops, but still higher than the low income. This could be because of the activities themselves, size of the city. So low income cities may not have as many vehicles, for example. High income countries, on the other hand, are definitely much lower at 18.5 micrograms per meter cube. Moving quickly to policies that improve air quality can help cities both mitigate and adapt to climate change, right? So it's obvious, if you have policy that improves air quality, then it will help cities both mitigate and adapt to climate change better. PM 2.5 and CO2 emissions are strongly positively correlated across cities globally. Relationships between CO2 and PM 2.5 emissions across cities globally, residential and transportation sectors 2015. This is the log of fossil CO2 emissions in 2015 in tons per year versus here log of fossil PM 2.5 emissions in 2015 in tons per year. So you can see the numbers are very different, and these are estimates. It's very easy to estimate CO2 emissions, whereas it's not so easy to estimate PM 2.5. Nonetheless, you can see that they have a significant correlation. As CO2 decreases, PM 2.5 decreases, and as CO2 increases, PM 2.5 increases. The sources are obviously always closely tied together. Key finding 8, less sprawling development is associated with lower CO2 and PM 2.5 emissions from the residential and transportation sectors. So if the city is built properly by accident or by plan, then commute miles are decreased, and residential and transportation sector emissions of both CO2 and PM 2.5 then are lower, right? More compact development is associated with lower emissions from the residential and transportation sectors. This is why there are many urban planning ideas on mixed neighborhoods, so that you have offices, schools, residential areas, and shops, commercial areas, or all close by, so that people can in fact mostly walk and leave the cars at home or somewhere. And public transportation or shuttles, especially electric vehicles, can connect people to short distances. Relationship between city compactness and PM 2.5 and CO2 emissions across cities globally in 2015. Here PM 2.5 is estimated effect of various city characteristics on emissions. So here residential sector, transportation sector, city compactness lower, log country GDP per capita, the residential sector, so the baseline here is 0, but you can see transportation sector is higher here and lower here. Log built up area is higher for residential sector, PM 2.5, and transportation. So estimated effect, so you have to see how the metric is defined. Log city population is higher, then transportation sector will be higher. CO2 from transportation sector, log of fossil fuel CO2 emissions 2015, city compactness, and you can see there is a negative correlation. So more compact the city, lower will be the CO2 emissions, and similarly PM 2.5, which you expect to be not as easy to nail down as CO2. But just keep the main message in mind that less sprawling development is associated with lower CO2 and PM 2.5 emissions from the residential and transportation sectors, obviously with co-benefits on health, especially for the young and the old, and so on. Okay. Key finding 9, cities that develop vertically consume less land, accommodate more people, and are more prosperous. Buying apartments in high rises always tends to be more expensive. So if city is growing more vertically, as let's say in Mumbai or Beijing, then that means housing prices are high and people are more prosperous to live there. Same for San Francisco or New York or any of these big cities. Cities that develop vertically accommodate more people and more prosperous and consume less land. Estimated elasticities of population, nighttime light intensity, and land area with respect to total sum of tall building heights. So here is estimated elasticity with respect to total height of a city's buildings, and you can see these are negative numbers here. So population elasticity is positive out to 15% in terms of estimated elasticity with respect to total height of a city's buildings, and lights are also positive here. Land area used will be negative because you use less and less land if you build vertically. That's just some simple data, but you should go and figure out how these things are defined if you're interested in these. Finally, key finding 10, lack of vegetation, especially evident in large cities and cities in upper middle income countries, and poor urban design can exacerbate the impacts of extreme heat events in cities, right? Average levels of vegetation are lowest for cities in upper middle income countries. So there is some kind of a Kuznets curve where the vegetation cover is not linearly proportional to income level. It peaks or bottoms out in the upper middle income countries. Average levels of greenness by city type 2012. So large cities with, this is again upper middle income, high income, and low and lower middle income. So average greenness index is surprisingly higher in each case for low and lower middle income cities for 2014. Similarly for medium cities, the entire thing is shifted to the right in terms of average greenness, and smaller cities have more average greenness. So as you begin to pack buildings and people and infrastructure and begin to clear out vegetation, the large cities tend to end up with lower greenness index on average, but surprisingly high income cities have some level of greenness. Lower income large cities have larger vegetation, and the minimum vegetation for large cities actually, or even the medium and small cities, is for upper middle income. So this typology definitely tells you something about how cities grow in size and how they deal with greenness. For example, rich people may begin to decide that we have built up enough, we should now grow more greenery, and they have the resources to do it. Low and lower middle income cities have do not have the population density or the resources to keep building, so the vegetation greenness index remains high, whereas upper middle income is probably building and sacrificing greenness more than the rich people without realizing it. Okay, the impact of climate change on cities, I won't read too much of this, but we have already dealt with climate change impacts in various ways, but in this context of cities it's worth reading. The impacts include here climate change related shocks and stresses can affect the greenness, resilience and inclusiveness of cities through a wide array of direct and indirect channels. Moreover, these shocks often do not occur in isolation and can be compounded by underlying urban challenges that arise from the pressure of growing urban populations on urban infrastructure, the supplies of basic services, land and housing, and the environment. Climate hazards can also cascade into cities from surrounding rural areas as well as from areas on which a city might depend for its water supply. So we talked about people migrating into cities during climate impacts, climate hazards. Inequalities within cities, which especially for many cities in low and lower middle income countries are already large, may be further exacerbated by climate change related shocks and stresses. And while cities have traditionally been thought of as providing escalators out of poverty, people move to cities with the hope, with the dream of employment, income, and riding the escalator out of poverty by moving to cities. Climate change actually may slow the speed of these escalators. Okay, so that's a nice paradigm or an analogy there. Let's read about policies for making cities greener, more resilient, and more inclusive in a world confronted by climate change. As the preceding sections have made clear, stresses associated with urban growth interact with climate change related stresses through a variety of channels. In doing so, they act against productivity enhancing agglomeration economies, adversely affecting the greenness, resilience, and inclusiveness of a city's development pathway. So we'll look at a figure, or you can look at the figure. It follows that to improve development outcomes, policymakers at the national and local levels need to work together to target these interrelated stresses in a way that best addresses a city's specific greenness, resilience, and inclusiveness challenges, where these challenges vary with both city's size and its level of development. To assist those efforts, this section lays out the general conclusions in 3 questions that policymakers should consider. I'm not going to go through the whole section, but we'll just read the questions. What policy instruments are available for protecting greenness, resilience, and inclusivity? Who wields these instruments? How can policy choices be prioritized, sequenced, and financed for effective implementation? Key questions, so policymakers obviously have to keep those things in mind. This is a long box. We'll come back and read about the 5 I's we mentioned before: information, incentives, insurance, integration, and investment. So we will read off a few things and also look at the challenges and so on when we come back and start the new podcast. Okay.